Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for Employment. This webinar series is brought to you by the Can Do Multiple Sclerosis, the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, and the Multiple Sclerosis Society of Canada. My name is Laura Allen, and I will be your moderator this evening. Can Do MS delivers health and wellness education programs to help families with MS thrive. Please visit the Can Do MS website, cando-ms.org, to learn about Can Do MS's online and nationwide in-person programs. The mission of the National MS Society is to help people affected by MS live their best lives as they stop MS in its tracks, restore what has been lost, and end MS forever. You can explore other societies' programs, services, resources, and connection opportunities at nationalmssociety.org. We will save about 20 minutes at the end of this webinar for questions and answers. If you have a question during the presentation, you can type it in using the questions chat box found in your control panel. This presentation is being recorded and will be archived on the Can Do MS website. You can download a copy of tonight's presentation and additional resources from your control panel. You will also be able to access these resources in the follow-up email that will be sent after the webinar. Our speakers this evening are Roz Kalb and Steve Nissen. Roz Kalb is a clinical psychologist who has specialized in MS care, support, and education for over 30 years. Roz was with the National MS Society from 2000 to 2016. She is currently working with the Society as a consultant, and she is also a senior programs consultant on the Can Do MS team. Good evening, Roz.
Good evening, Laura, and hello, Steve. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Steve is currently the Director of MS Navigator Services Delivery at the National MS Society. In that role, he oversees the provision of services, information, resources, and support to people affected by MS. He also leads the nationwide work in ensuring people affected by MS connect with health insurance, benefits, and employment information and resources. He has been with the Society since 1998. Good evening, Steve.
Thanks so much, Laura. Very good to see you again, Roz, and thanks so much for letting me be a part of this program tonight.
One of the things that Steve and I wanted to do tonight was give you a little information about COVID-19 from the employment perspective, and we'll do that before diving into the main part of our webinar. So Steve, what can you tell us about COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks so much, Roz. Yeah, you know, as you were saying, we had been talking about ways to address fatigue, mood, and cognition, but with what has transpired in the world, we figured we need to at least kind of get this COVID-19 stuff kind of out of the way, because we have definitely seen such a significant impact in the workforce. So these truly are some unprecedented times in terms of people losing their jobs, being furloughed across so many different fields, jobs, and industries. There have been several newer pieces of legislation that have been passed that do provide some expanded benefits, protections, and income replacement strategies. You see here the two that we talk mainly about is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and the CARES Act. These two laws do provide some protections, including paid sick leave, paid and/or expanded Family Medical Leave Act, pandemic unemployment insurance benefits. Just to let you all know, these are very complex laws, though, with very specific eligibility criteria to meet. So typically when someone contacts the Society to get connected with an MS Navigator, we would typically suggest that they go directly to the source. We have done our best to fully understand the protections as much as we can. For instance, some have very specific criteria to meet. For instance, the Paid Family Medical Leave Act just applies to parents who have small children at home. So there are very specific criteria to meet. The next slide that I'll show you, though, does list who those specific agencies are to learn more about those protections to determine if you might be if you might be able to tap into them. But from an employment perspective, really one of the first places that we like to start is just making sure that people are looking at ways to maintain their employment through requesting accommodations. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, we're going to be talking about reasonable accommodations here shortly. That is still the land of the law, and we are definitely the law of the land, and we are still looking at ways to see, can a person maybe request some sort of accommodation to stay employed so as to not have to separate from the workforce. And this is just some of kind of the most relevant resources that I would encourage folks to connect with. Just to point out a few, through the National MS Society, we do have a fairly extensive COVID-19 page which lists resources, whether it's financial resources, workplace employment concerns, tax assistance, housing resources, really kind of, because again, we know that this pandemic has completely kind of upended so many different components of our lives. And like I said before, kind of going directly to the source, the Department of Labor, which is the agency that enforces that paid sick leave, the Family Medical Leave Act. For the unemployment benefits, that does vary from state to state. So this is the link that a person can go to visit to get connected to their unemployment, their specific unemployment office. So that's just a few quick words on something that has completely turned our life into a bit of upheaval over the past several weeks.
But it's very reassuring, Steve, that so many of these government offices have devoted very significant resources around COVID, so that I think this list is reassuring in the sense that people have lots of places to go to ask questions. So thank you for filling us in on them. So for the rest of the program tonight, we have some specific objectives that we hope all of you on the call will have a better understanding of the factors that can compromise employment. And again, we're going to be focusing on 3 very common and visible symptoms of MS that have a real impact on employment. Steve is going to explore your rights in the workplace so that you have a clear understanding of what you can and can't do proactively to protect your employment, and also what you can do if you're running into difficulties. We're going to talk about the process that's involved in disclosing your disability in the workplace, and most important of all, how to request the accommodations that can help you continue to be a productive and active employee on the job. And we're going to talk some about what strategies you can use for communicating with your coworkers about your MS and whatever accommodations you request. So before we dive into our first vignette, I think I just want to comment a little bit about why this is so important. And for all of us, work has a very central role in our daily lives. It's not just something that takes up a huge amount of our waking hours, but it's central to how we think of ourselves when we meet people for the first time. One of the very first things we say about ourselves after our name is what we do. That is how we think of ourselves and how others think of us. So maintaining your work is part of maintaining your identity. It's also a source of huge amount of personal growth and fulfillment. We get satisfaction when we feel we're doing a good job at our work. It stimulates us intellectually, provides a lot of enjoyment if we're lucky enough, like Steve and I are, to have jobs that we love. And it's a lot about personal relationships and connections with colleagues. Of course, we work because we need to earn a living, and that means that our work is a very significant part of our lives in keeping us and our families secure. And it also provides benefits for many people, including the health insurance that is so vital when you're living with MS. So keep that in mind as we talk about these vignettes, how central work is to the people we're going to be talking about. So Steve, do you want to introduce us to Maria?
Sure, I would love to. So just going to talk a couple minutes about Maria. You see some basic kind of demographic information here about her. She's a 52-year-old graphic designer, significant commute. Again, prior to COVID, needed to go into an office. It was about an hour and a half commute. And what she was finding was that she was falling asleep at her desk. It was difficult to concentrate. Just things were falling through the cracks. And she was giving so much to work that she didn't have much left for kind of the rest of her life, for her family, for her social life, for her support network. You know, we start with fatigue because, you know, as Roz said, definitely fatigue, cognitive symptoms, mood, those are three of the most, I would say, common symptoms that have real significant impact in a person's ability to work for the long term. But, you know, in thinking about Maria, again, if Maria were to contact me as an MS Navigator, part of that benefits and employment support team, want to start off with from a disclosure perspective. Does your employer even know? Because put yourself in the shoes of the employer. All that the employer is seeing is Maria's falling asleep at her desk, or she's missing meetings, or she's missing these sorts of deadlines. So just bring awareness to the challenges of the invisibility of these types of symptoms. We would want to make sure that Maria kind of fully understands her legal rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, you know, might there be some reasonable accommodations? We're going to give you some concrete sort of examples of what reasonable accommodations look like later on in tonight's program. But it could be some practical things like requesting some more frequent breaks, maybe teleworking for part of the time. You know, sometimes even just one day per week can really make a big difference. You know, some general lifestyle changes from a kind of like energy conservation perspective. Might there be things that she could do the night before, laying out her clothes, making her lunch, just planning for her day so she can get some of those getting to work activities done the night before, so she can best conserve the energy that she has. And really also just, I think with fatigue, just that the importance of realizing the work-life balance. Maria's giving so much to work that, like I said, she really has limited time, limited energy left for those other parts of her life, which is so important for her satisfaction, for her support, for her feeling of wellness. And this is a fairly, though this is Maria's story, I know that I've heard similar types of stories from so many of the constituents that I've worked with throughout the years. Roz, can you maybe just share with us a little bit about what we know about fatigue in general in terms of just the symptoms, the prevalence, those sorts of things?
So it's absolutely the most common symptom of MS. The studies vary, but 75 to 83% of people experience fatigue. And many of those who experience it say it's actually the symptom that causes them the most difficulty in their daily lives. They find it the most disabling. What's tricky about fatigue in people with MS is that it can be caused by a variety of things. So one of the things that has to happen when you report the symptom of fatigue to your healthcare providers is that they have to help you tease out what is contributing to the fatigue that you have, because all of those factors, when they are addressed appropriately, can help reduce your feelings of fatigue and therefore its impact on your life. So what we call primary fatigue in MS or lassitude is actually caused by the MS disease process itself. It's thought to result from that demyelination that happens in the central nervous system as a result of inflammation in the disease process. And vast majority of people have it. It's a feeling unlike any other fatigue that the rest of us experience. It just slams you against a wall, and it can happen any time of day, and people have difficulty describing it because it's so different from what the rest of us know. But in addition to that primary fatigue, several other things happen to people with MS that can contribute to feelings of tiredness, sleepiness, and fatigue. And one is that sleep is very often disrupted in people with MS. They are known to have more primary sleep disturbances than other people, which is why sleep studies are often recommended to find out what's actually happening to the sleep architecture in the body that might be disrupting sleep patterns. But also, people who have bladder issues and are getting up 4, 5, 6 times a night are not getting a good night's rest, and they won't until those bladder symptoms are managed. Depression, which we'll talk about in a minute, is also very, very common in people with MS, and one of the cardinal symptoms of depression can be disturbed sleep and not being able to get a good night's sleep, or feeling so tired all the time that all you want to do is sleep. Deconditioning is what occurs when people can't be as active as they used to be. So they're not getting as much exercise or physical activity, and their muscles actually become deconditioned. And deconditioned muscles have to work harder to do basic activities like walking. And so that becomes much more tiring. And of course, medication side effects, if you look at the labels of many, many medications, it talks about sleepiness as a side effect, and many people with MS are taking quite a handful of medications. So if you put all those things together, they can really contribute to the fatigue, which can then impact employment.
Definitely.
And I just want to add one thing, and that is that the member of the healthcare team that is really a specialist in this is the occupational therapist. So once your neurologist or nurse practitioner teases out what are the contributing factors to your fatigue, then you can work with an occupational therapist to figure out how to conserve energy and how to use the energy that you have in the most effective way over the course of the day.
Definitely. Definitely.
So I think we're ready to talk about Samuel and cognitive issues.
Yes. So similar to Maria, we wanted to kind of present Samuel as a way to just to think about how cognitive symptoms might present themselves in the workplace. So you see here, Samuel, 42-year-old data analyst, is easily distracted by people walking past his desk, difficulty multitasking, difficulty prioritizing, when kind of having those casual hallway conversations, requesting things for him to follow up on. By the time he got back to his desk, he had forgotten what was talked about or what kind of his next steps or his part of that project was going to be, and just simply missing the deadlines. So these are some kind of behavioral sorts of examples of what cognitive symptoms might look like within the workplace. We definitely know that cognitive symptoms are very difficult to accommodate within the workplace, but it's possible. And Roz is going to kind of talk about some of the things that could be done, professional evaluations and those sorts of things. But just also want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that come within the workplace too. So many of us work within a cubicle environment. So there's that noise, there's the distractions, there's the people walking by. So there are some things that may be kind of inherent in the workplace that can contribute towards maybe exacerbating those sorts of cognitive symptoms or making them more difficult to manage. So we'll talk about things, some practical things later on in terms of the accommodations, but just to get you thinking, reminders, looking at where your desk is physically located. If I can share with you, I did work with one client years ago who kind of the employer suggested that they don't have those hallway meetings, or if they did occur when people got back to their desk, they sent an email to summarize that conversation, and they found that that helped to improve the productivity of their entire staff, not just that one employee who was living with MS, and they kind of instituted that, across the board. So again, I bring these types of examples up to make it clear in terms of what this might look like. Again, putting yourself in the employer's shoes and trying to be proactive, trying to get ahead of it, and trying to think objectively about what am I experiencing, and what can be done to help me manage this. So Roz, what are some of the prevalence that we see with cognitive symptoms, and what are some of the things that people might be able to do to really get a handle on those?
So I just want to make a comment as I'm listening to you talk about cognitive issues in the workplace and fatigue, that maybe one benefit that's going to come out of COVID-19 is that there's going to be some awareness that for some people, working remotely from home actually leads to better productivity, better concentration, but not all of us. But I think maybe there'll be more ability to request some of these accommodations that will change your environment based on what we learned from COVID. But anyway,
that is just to piggyback off of that, that is definitely one of my hopes, and I've spoken with like disability employment lawyers and to others in the disability employment community, and that's one of the things that I'm really hoping for. Is prior to this, sometimes the employer was wary of letting somebody to telecommute, to work from home. Now we've all had to. So I'm very much hopeful that it's going to become less of an issue once people do have to re-enter the work site, that they might be able to request telework or telecommuting as a reasonable accommodation. So my fingers are definitely crossed for that too, Roz.
So let's talk about cognition a little bit, because it is right up there near fatigue as being very common. We now know that at least 65% of people with MS are going to experience some degree of cognitive changes at some point. And that can take all different forms. The cardinal change that happens in MS is a slowing of a person's ability to process incoming information. We process information with our brains 24/7, right? And what happens for some people with MS is what they describe as a feeling of like molasses in their brains. They can do the same things that they did before, but everything is slowed. And so from the employer's perspective, looking at somebody with slowed processing, they're not able to keep up with a conversation, or they're not able to respond quickly to a question, because they're having to really work through the thought process more slowly. It can be much harder for a person with MS to learn new information. It may take more trials to learn something new, more practice. Once they learn it, they will tend to remember it. But many people with MS report difficulties with learning new things quickly and then holding on to them. As Steve mentioned, problems with attention and concentration. People may be easily distracted, and once they're interrupted, they can't get back to what they were doing or thinking about, or the opposite. They can feel like they're stuck, and they're focused on something and they're stuck, and even when they need to turn their attention to something else, they find it very difficult to do that shift. Executive functions are the things we all do in our everyday lives all the time. We make decisions, we plan, we prioritize, we organize our tasks. We figure out how to complete a project from step one to completion, and people have a lot of difficulty with those executive functions, which of course has a major impact in the workplace if you have assignments that you have to complete. Now, the interesting thing about these cognitive changes is that they're essentially unrelated to level of physical disability. And the biggest implication of that is that nobody can tell by looking at a person with MS whether he or she has cognitive difficulties. You can't assume that because somebody has very significant physical disability that they have cognitive impairment. And you certainly can't assume that because somebody has no visible physical symptoms that they have no cognitive impairment. Cognitive impairment can appear as the very first symptom of MS. So the National MS Society now recommends that everybody is screened for cognitive issues at the time of diagnosis and periodically thereafter. So it's just not so related to time you've had MS or level of physical disability, but it does tend to occur more in people with progressive MS. So you get this screening if you're fortunate and you self-advocate and you make sure that you get it. And if it is determined that there's a change of some sort, then you can have a more extensive evaluation that can take from 20 minutes to 40 minutes to 90 minutes, depending on the person who's doing the evaluation. But that will give you more details about where you're having difficulties and where your strengths are. Because when you ask for an accommodation to deal with cognitive issues, you're going to want to capitalize on your strengths in order to help you compensate for any areas where you're having difficulties. If at any point you need to apply for Social Security disability based on cognition, that is when you absolutely must have a full neuropsych battery of tests in order to support that application. And that is that 8-hour full evaluation that many of you have heard about. So that's the one time when you absolutely need to go full throttle and have that full assessment. At this point, we don't have any medications that have been shown to be effective managing cognitive changes. But what we do know is that cognitive rehabilitation, working with a rehabilitation specialist around your cognitive issues, is very successful and it's essential. And what that treatment involves is helping you identify compensatory tools and strategies that address your specific cognitive deficits. And those can then be the foundation for the accommodations that you might request to enhance your performance.
And definitely, Roz, just to kind of piggyback off of that, I've definitely worked with clients throughout the years that, you know, especially when they're going in for that cognitive testing, whether it's the full battery, but to be forthcoming with the neuropsychologist in terms of, you know, I'm looking for strategies to help me stay employed. That it's been so useful to see those reports when clients have shared them with me, where really those neuropsychologists are suggesting the accommodations that are really can be very beneficial. Because as you said, though there's no treatment, there are significant ways to compensate for it. And those compensatory strategies can help both at home, but especially can definitely be beneficial in the workplace.
And I just want to say one word about who the folks are who can help you with this. So Steve just mentioned neuropsychologist, and that certainly is the individual who would do that full 8-hour neuropsych battery. But I think it's also important to know that assessments can be done by speech language pathologists and by some occupational therapists. And depending on where you live in the country, what your insurance coverage is, you might see any one of those 3 specialists to get your preliminary assessments. And the occupational therapists, as they are with fatigue, are magical at helping you identify those compensatory strategies and techniques that you might use in your office, as are the speech language pathologists.
Definitely. Yes. Thank you so much for clarifying that, Roz.
So Steve, can you now introduce us to Naomi?
Yes. So Again, our last symptom that we're going to talk about tonight that definitely can and does oftentimes impact work is mood. So again, you see here Naomi, who's a 37-year-old teacher. And again, like what we've done with the first two constituent vignettes, just what might this symptom look like to an employer in the workplace, or that the employee might recognize that they're having these sorts of symptoms. So Naomi, as a teacher, she's feeling disconnected to her job. She used to love going to work. She's just not feeling that excited about going to work. She has a little patience. She's irritated by her students or by her colleagues. And she's tired, she's lethargic, she may be calling out sick on a more frequent basis. And it's just really kind of harder for her to set goals, both for herself as well as for her class. And she generally doesn't necessarily care about the results. So again, I mean, this is what mood disorders, mood challenges might look like. And in Naomi's situation as a teacher, it's so important to exhibit patience, to exhibit support, to exhibit understanding, not only of her students, but of her colleagues and her students' parents. Thinking about, might there be ways that she can step away from the work to recharge, to reframe her work and her mindset, to practice skills that she might be learning in therapy. Again, kind of that willingness to talk with your healthcare providers of what's going on, so that way then these symptoms can be managed. You know, maybe taking some time away from work to focus on herself, to try to get her symptoms kind of better under control, to let treatment, medications, whatever comprises her treatment picture, to let those kind of kick in. And I think what Naomi also, to me, Roz, just makes me think about, and there's a reason why we chose these three symptoms, but these three symptoms are so oftentimes dovetail together. Where one starts and where the other begins oftentimes is very difficult to identify, and one may make another worse or make it more prevalent. So I think really, again, here's where what's clearly cognitive, what's clearly mood, what's clearly fatigue may not be crystal clear, but more importantly, who do we need to talk to about it, to identify it, and what is it that can be done in order to manage it? So what do we know about managing mood disorders?
One of my favorite questions, Steve. Thanks. So we're going to focus on depression tonight, but I just have to put in a word that anxiety, severe anxiety, is at least as common in people with MS and can also dovetail with those other symptoms that we've been talking about. But more than half of people with MS will experience a very major depression at some point in the course of the disease. And the reason is that depression in MS is caused by several different factors. It's not just a person's reaction to life with a challenging, unpredictable chronic illness, which would be enough. But we know that depression is also related to changes in the immune system and to changes in the brain. So like other inflammatory diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, for example, depression is just more prevalent related to that inflammation. And as you alluded to, Steve, recognizing and managing depression is important, not just because depression is incredibly painful to experience, I mean, very, very painful, but it also makes all your other symptoms feel worse. So it makes your fatigue feel more fatiguing. It makes pain, physical pain, feel more uncomfortable. And it can certainly impact your cognition. And so when you have any of these other symptoms, one of the things we want to do right away is identify if you're depressed, because if you are depressed and we treat the depression, some of these other symptoms will also get better. one of the things to notice in people with MS, depression can often appear as irritability or moodiness. This was discovered by Dr. Sarah Minden in a Cardinal study many, many years ago. And it's one of the things that contributes to it not being diagnosed as readily. People don't recognize that unusual irritability is actually often a symptom of depression. We need to treat it because in addition to being painful and making other symptoms feel worse, it can be life-threatening. It is one of the cardinal reasons that the risk of suicide in people with MS is higher than in the general population. We are doing an inadequate job of recognizing depression and treating it, and it has dire consequences. And I just need to throw in a note that support partners of people with MS are also at increased risk of depression. That's not just support partners in MS, but in any chronic illness. And we need to keep an eye on our loved ones who support us, because they also are at significant risk for depression. So like cognition, there are strong recommendations now for screening. We want people to be screened mood-wise at the time of diagnosis and periodically thereafter. But you also should know that if your healthcare provider is not doing that screening, and that could be your MS provider, your primary care physician, whoever it is, they should be screening you for mood. But you can also go online. Mental Health America, and your website is up here. They offer free, confidential online screening for a variety of mood disorders. It's really an amazing service. You go on, you answer questions from validated screening tools, and they send you a report. You get an email score, which you can then share with your healthcare provider and say, it looks like I've screened positive for this. I'd like to talk about how I could get some help with it. Fortunately, there are some excellent treatment strategies for mood changes. Talk therapy is very, very important. Most of the research has been done on cognitive behavior therapy, which is a type of intervention, but any good therapist with a therapist who knows what he or she is doing and with whom you can build a trusting relationship can offer you very helpful psychotherapy. Medication, when you need it, is a very important second leg of the stool. Those medications work very well. There are many options, and they work in tandem with the talk therapy for optimal benefit. And we now know that exercise improves mood. So exercise that meets your particular needs, whatever your physical limitations are or aren't, an exercise program can be devised for you. And that's the third leg of the stool. Those three together are the best mood management strategies we have. So now, before we learn more about requesting accommodations in the workplace, we'd like to ask a polling question. So, have you ever gone through the process of requesting a reasonable accommodation from your employer? One of those answers should be no. So we have a yes. Let's assume that the first yes is yes, and the second yes is no, and the third is considering it now. Hope that doesn't confuse you too much. Well, let's see. Okay. So we're about half divided between yes and yes. So I'm going to assume that a little more than half of you have not ever requested an accommodation, but very close to half of you have, and a good number are considering it now. So Steve, can you walk us through what that means and what to expect out of the process?
Great, definitely, I would love to. So just, again, we're going to shift a little bit we're going to shift gears a little bit here just to talk a little bit more about what the process might look like. But we wanted to draw your attention in the GoToWebinar platform under the handout section. There is a handout that you can download. It is called Analyzing the Effects of MS on Work. I would strongly encourage you to download this, to save it to your computer, to print it out, whatever way works for you, because we're going to be kind of, again, moving into this process, how disclosure relates to accommodations. We definitely know that each person and each circumstance is different. So the examples, the things that we're going to be talking about tonight may really apply to you, but it's also important to look at your specific situation, your particular circumstances. One of the most important things, and this is where I really feel like that this handout can prove useful, is that it will allow you to think proactively about your employment situation. What we know from an employment counseling perspective is that many times people don't reach out to us until they're facing some sort of an employment crisis. So it's important to try to get ahead of, again, these symptoms. Again, we are just focusing on these 3 symptoms tonight, but there may be some additional symptoms that are posing significant challenges to you within the workplace. So think about your situation, talk to trusted people to get that objective input in terms of maybe what other people might be seeing, because using this handout can prove very beneficial for you in terms of just trying to figure out what accommodations might fit for you, for your job, for your symptoms, and for your particular circumstance. So you see here just 2, I think some of the best kind of descriptions or the definitions of what a reasonable accommodation, or what a reasonable accommodation is. So this comes from the Job Accommodation Network, which is a resource that I'm going to be talking about here just a little while. But this is a free federal service funded by the US Department of Labor. And again, you see here the definition. It's a modification or it's an adjustment to a job, the work environment, or the way that things are usually done that would enable a qualified individual with a disability to enjoy an equal employment opportunity. Some of this language does come specifically from the Americans with Disabilities Act. That is the primary law that is designed to prevent against discrimination of people with disabilities in a variety of different settings, but one specific section or title, Title I, deals specifically with workplace issues and employment. So the ADA does allow a qualified individual the right to request a reasonable accommodation in order to perform the essential functions of their job. And you see here just some examples just to get you started. Restructuring jobs, modifying work schedules, getting some sort of specialized equipment, assistive technology, something that we have definitely seen can prove to be beneficial in terms of managing fatigue and cognitive symptoms. Reassignment is also actually a lesser known reasonable accommodation. So you see here, and Roz, I think back to something that even you said just a few minutes ago, and I'm going to start with the last bullet point on the slide. The accommodations is designed to increase your productivity. So think about how these accommodations, these modifications, and things that you might be requesting in the workplace that's going to help you be more efficient and effective. What you're wanting to kind of sell in a way to your employer is that this is going to be a win-win. It's hopefully not going to be very taxing for that employer in terms of what is that reasonable accommodation, that practical thing that you might be requesting. But the ultimate goal is to help you to work as effectively and efficiently as you possibly can. What is important to know is that the responsibility for requesting the accommodations does fall on the employee. So again, here's where, what is it that you can do proactively? Do your homework, connect with some of the resources that I'm gonna share with you, get those professional evaluations, talk to your doctors, um, and the employers only need to accommodate known disabilities. So here's where disclosure and accommodations really do dovetail together. The other thing to keep in mind is that the accommodations that you need today might not be what you need a week from now, 6 months from now, 2 years from now. So especially with MS, the variability and the unpredictability, requesting accommodations is not necessarily something that a person only needs to think of and deal with one time. But there may be opportunities, or there may be the need to revisit this accommodation process either when your symptoms change, when you get a new job, when you get a new supervisor. So there's a lot of different factors that may really contribute towards somebody needing to rethink and to revisit this accommodation request process. But again, to kind of keep it in the back of your mind, think of accommodations as being a productivity enhancer. There are, again, many creative ways. We've really focused on some of the invisible symptoms today, and those, again, many times may be difficult to broach those subjects with your employer because of that "but you look so good" mentality. But these are symptoms that, as we've talked about tonight, can and do pose significant challenges to people with MS in the workplace. So you have the right to request these sorts of reasonable accommodations. You see here some additional examples, flexible work schedules, as we were talking before. I'm really definitely very hopeful that as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic, that flexible work schedules, especially telecommuting, working at home, is going to be seen as a more mainstream reasonable accommodation. But think about the ergonomic setup of your office. There are things that you can request or that you can do that will help minimize that fatigue. Computer technology, assistive technology, things like voice recognition software, trackballs, those sorts of things. The right strategies and solution are going to vary from person to person, from job to job, and they can vary from time to time. So again, it is one of those things to just be aware. No two people are the same, no two jobs are the same, no two employers are the same. But again, do your homework. The bulk of the responsibility does fall on you, the employee, but this is supposed to be an interactive process. So again, that's language under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it is up to the employee to broach the subject, but it should be, or it can be, should be a back and forth kind of negotiating what's going to work for you, the employee, and what it's going to work for the employer. So we just want to highlight here again, given that we've been focusing tonight on fatigue, cognitive, and mood, you see here just some practical accommodations. And what I also want you to think about is many of these, or really most of these accommodations, don't cost a lot of money. When it comes down to accommodations, the Job Accommodation Network has done research studies throughout the years that shows that most accommodations for people with disabilities don't cost anything. And when there is a cost, it's many times a one-time cost, on the average of less than around $500. So, but you see here fatigue, flexible work schedules, more frequent and longer breaks, rest areas, doing the telework, cognition, again, looking at ways to eliminate the distractions, day planners, utilizing the memory aids. There are so many kind of built-in things nowadays into our computers that will, bells and whistles that will go off that can prove very beneficial. And with mood, again, flexible work arrangements, requesting the time off. In Naomi's situation as a teacher, she was able to request not doing that lunch duty because that kind of gave her that needed break. And she was able to request getting an assistant to help her out in the workplace, or in the classroom. So that way then she could kind of work in conjunction with somebody when maybe she needed to step away. To request accommodations, though, disclosure is usually one of those first steps. And Roz, I know that this can sometimes be a really difficult conversation. So what can you share with us just some general tips about disclosure?
So I think it's a huge step for people to disclose in the workplace, and it is a very, very personal decision, and different people will make the decision differently. But as you said before, Steve, any request for accommodation has to be based on your employer knowing that you have a disability, not necessarily that you have MS, but that you have a disability. So you have to think about this disclosure process as the first step to getting the accommodations that will help you be a more productive employee. So in general, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in general, if you have no visible symptoms of MS and you don't need any accommodations at the moment, the general recommendation is not to disclose. There's no reason to disclose your MS or a disability if you're not going to request anything. However, for some people working in a very, very small office where they're very close to their manager and their coworkers, they simply feel uncomfortable keeping a big secret. And sometimes those folks will choose to disclose even before they need an accommodation, simply because they feel better doing that in the workplace, and that's fine. I would just encourage anybody who's trying to make that decision to call one of the MS navigators at the society and speak to an employment specialist to just talk about the pros and cons of doing that. But you definitely may need to disclose in order to get an accommodation or a short-term disability leave. Now, by law, you're only required to disclose the disability that you have for which you are requesting an accommodation. But ultimately, it's very often true that you will need to disclose that you have MS at some point down the road. We certainly don't encourage anybody to tell an untruth, heaven forbid, particularly if you have a new job and you're having an employment physical or anything like that. That can really come back to bite you if you are untruthful on your initial questionnaire or your exam taking the new job. I think you need to think carefully about how you want to do the disclosure. And again, the MS navigators can help you with that, as can the Job Accommodation Network. Their expertise is in helping you put the language together about how to disclose in the most effective way, how to make it that win-win conversation or dialogue that Steve was talking about. And so you don't have to do it alone. You can do it with these experts at your elbow. And you can also rehearse your disclosure script with a close friend or an MS navigator. But I think the important thing is not to treat your employer as an adversary, but rather to approach it as a collegial dialogue where you're explaining to your employer how you can be the most productive employee possible, and that this will help you. So, Steve, can you add to anything I said, or do you just have some tips for folks?
Yeah, you covered it perfectly. Yeah, and again, disclosure is probably one of the most stressful employment dilemmas that people with MS grapple with at some point of their life working with MS. So it is definitely something to not go into light, to not just make a rash decision, but to really be thoughtful. These are kind of some of my just parting thoughts in terms of this process, in terms of the disclosure and accommodation process. Just, you know, I had mentioned that it's supposed to be an interactive process, so be open to questions. Don't, you know, don't be defensive. As much as you can, all of that prep work, thinking proactively, reaching out to resources is going to increase your confidence in having this conversation with your employer. There may be some back and forth, so have backup plans. And by that, I mean, you know, you may come up with a laundry list of types of accommodations, but maybe start with one or start with two. Or if the employer says, you know what, we can't do that, but what about this? It's again, really kind of bringing to light the interactive process. I think it is so important to not be so set in terms of it's this or nothing. It's really, again, you want to build off of that relationship, the rapport that you have with your employer. And so you want to show, maybe, can we try this accommodation for a period of time? And then we're going to be able to reevaluate it, because you know what? It might not work for me just as much as it might not work for you, the employer. So kind of have that back and forth. As we talked about before, present it as a win-win, and don't hesitate to reach out to the resources. We've got some slides here, and in the interest of time, again, these slides you can download, but we've already mentioned the MS Society and our Navigator program. Please do reach out to us. We do have a specialty team of MS Navigators that focus in on benefits, employment, and insurance. So we can talk through the ADA and the Family Medical Leave Act and disclosure and accommodation. So you see here the multiple channels by which people can connect. Here's just a sampling of some of the brochures and the literature that we have that's geared towards the employer community, that's geared towards people with MS. Roz, you mentioned Social Security. We also know that there may be a point in time when people decide that it's time to separate from the workforce. So please do reach out to the National MS Society and we can point you in the right direction. Roz, you mentioned the Job Accommodation Network. I mentioned them as well. These are some of, in my opinion, some of the most useful links and resources in the publications that Jan produces that list practical accommodation strategies, give you an example of what that reasonable accommodation request kind of form letter might look like. So again, there's a wealth of information on their site.
And I would just point out, in addition to those resources, Steve, that on the Can Do MS website, we have webinars dealing with each of these invisible symptoms. So how to manage fatigue, cognitive changes, and mood changes. We could just do the tip of the iceberg tonight. So please check out those webinars.
Definitely.
Laura's back.
All right, I think we are time for Q&A. So what are you seeing coming in for us, Laura, tonight?
We talked quite a bit about disclosure. Excuse me, we talked quite a bit about disclosure, but I had a question about education. So educating my fellow coworkers. And we got actually a real life scenario. And our participant writes, I recently left my job because another person with MS made a mockery of me and my type of MS. It was difficult to educate those around me, and she was able to do more physical tasks than I was. I was forced out of my job. How would you recommend I educate my fellow coworkers on the next go round?
Wow, that took my breath away. We never hear about one person with MS, you know, being hard on another person with MS. So I'll start, and I will just say that, you know, I think it's very hard for people in the world to understand the disease itself, how individual it is, how variable it is, why some people have symptoms that you can see, and some people have many, many symptoms that can't be seen. And it really is about putting your teaching hat on and providing people with resources from Can Do MS or the National MS Society that explain the kinds of symptoms you have, and being able to explain what part of your activities at work your symptoms might impact and what they don't impact. You know, you have to self-advocate, particularly if you have another colleague who is trying to put you in a bad light, which should never happen. But if that does happen, you really need to advocate for yourself and talk about what you can do, and particularly what you can do with accommodations. Steve, does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And oftentimes, Roz, when I'm talking to people about disclosure, I relate disclosure to education, because you, by disclosing, and again, in this situation, I mean, obviously, you know, again, I'm still just so dumbfounded that something like that would happen. So forgive me. You know, maybe starting off with a manager or with your manager or someone from HR, and to say, you know what, maybe we could do something in regard to disability awareness. You know, I can say personally, throughout my years working for the National MS Society, you know, I have had the opportunity to go into the employer's settings and to do some in-service trainings, whether it's in recognition of National Disability Employment Awareness Month, which is a federally recognized month every fall, that, you know, the employer is willing to do that sort of education with the entire staff. So we've done webinars, and this was even before COVID, that just so that way that we can reach a wide group of people. I do feel like that in this situation, really with any situation, for you to be the one in control of the messaging, for you to be the one to speak up for yourself, it's horrible that happened, and that may make you shy away from speaking up again. But that's a way to make sure that your colleagues, your coworkers are hearing directly from your mouth what your MS is like, and what you can bring to the workforce. Again, I think even with coworkers, you don't want to dwell on the negative with MS. Yes, this is something that you've been diagnosed with, that you're dealing with, but that you've also learned ways to manage it, and that you're a productive coworker too. So those are some other thoughts that I had, Roz.
Great, thank you. You know, keeping along those same lines, one of our participants writes that, I'm not sure if it's he or she, but they are an executive and they want to disclose to their staff. So it's a similar scenario, but what advice would you give to that person?
Roz, I think it might be a lot of the same. I think controlling the information, you know, as a manager, and Roz, I'm going to start with this one. Sorry, I just jumped in. You know, I think as a manager, as a supervisor, as someone who may be in a leadership role, to, you know, if they decide to have this conversation, to explain the why behind it, that you're not looking for your subordinates to treat you any different, or you're not looking for them to be so focused on checking in with you every day. How are you feeling? Are you doing okay? Is there anything that I can do? That this might be something that you as an executive are wanting to share, just to be more transparent with your team, but you're not looking to them or for them to treat you any different. And I think that's sometimes difficult, because, and I think, Roz, you could probably say this too, and I've seen it too, sometimes when people disclose not only in the workplace but to their friends or their family, those other family members can be so focused just on the MS. So whenever you see that person, how are you feeling? Do you need anything from me? Those sorts of things. So to to explain some of the why behind it would probably be something to keep in mind. What is your purpose, and what do you expect your employees to do as a result of knowing this information?
So, you know, I think it's once again putting on your teaching hat with a purpose to explain what's going on, as Steve said, but a slightly different take on this. So our scenario of the young teacher, this is another, she's not an executive, obviously, but she was a teacher in a classroom with students. And one of the things that she had to do was to share some information about MS with her students, because her MS was causing her increasing fatigue. She was having some memory issues. And so she recruited her students. She told them about her MS, and she explained to them the ways in which it affected her. And she gave them specific responsibilities that they had in order to help them all in the classroom be more successful. Sometimes the student would do the writing on the board if she couldn't manage the writing on the board, or if she couldn't think of a word, it became a classroom game so that the students had to help her fill in the blanks. And it accomplished two things. She was a very, very gifted teacher who was very, very popular with her students. And it worked because the kids became very aware, disability aware. They became very helpful. They were proud of what they were able to do to help in the classroom. And then they formed an MS SBAC team that raised more money than any other team in the county. So sometimes as a leader, whether it's as an executive or a teacher in a classroom, you engage the people you are working with in ways that help everybody benefit.
Thanks, Roz. So as we've mentioned earlier, we are in a new world with COVID-19. It's unprecedented territory for many of us. And so we did have someone specifically ask what tips you have for searching for work during the COVID pandemic.
So this is a great question, and actually, I've been very pleased to see that employers are hiring, and I've actually read some professional journal articles or just professional stories recently that some work at home jobs are really targeting people with disabilities now. So I can tell you personally, I got an email today from an employer that is looking to hire. So the jobs are definitely still out there. If you would like to connect with the National MS Society, we do have a fairly extensive list of job boards. Some job boards that are specific for people with disabilities. Actually, the National MS Society does have a job board. There's some other ones out there like Getting Hired that are from employers that are looking to hire qualified people with disabilities, but jobs are still out there. Getting Hired, I know, did just do a virtual job fair just last week. So it is still possible. It might take a little bit longer. Again, we're changing how we hire. You're going to be doing virtual job interviews, those sorts of things, which we maybe some people had those sorts of experiences before, but definitely do feel free to contact the MS Navigator. Within each state, there is a state workforce board. There are just different sorts of resources out there that are still, there are legitimate jobs that, and some that were already kind of advertised to be work at home, but some that, given the current climate, are transitioning home. So definitely, I would say don't give up and tap into the resources that you were used to using, because there definitely are these jobs out there.
Do you want to add anything, Roz, before we conclude?
No, I was just going to ask if we were going to get to meet your cat.
Oh.
It's been going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So
if you would like to, she is now curled up on my lap, so I will officially put Olive on this on this webinar. This is Olive. She is our 8-year-old tuxedo kitty who has wanted to be on camera pretty much all night tonight. So thank you for calling her out, Roz, and letting her be a part of tonight's webinar.
You know,
I would just encourage everybody to remember how we started this, that work is very central to who you are and how you think about yourself. And I think Steve's advice is fantastic, that if you can be proactive, if you have worries about how MS might impact your employment in the future, don't wait until you're in a crisis situation. This is the time to think about it, to talk to an MS navigator about it. What would I do if these symptoms started to interfere? How can I be prepared for that? What do I need to do to get educated? This is the time to be doing that work on your own behalf. So please do it.
Perfect.
excellent. Thank you, Roz, and thanks, Steve. And I simply must add that having our pets on a webinar is simply a sign of the times.
Exactly. So thank you all for putting up with Olive coming and going. So
It was very nice.
It is you know what? It's actually really a wonderful part of this world that we're in right now,
yes,
that our pets can
I
be
agree.
part of our daily lives. So that being said, we do have some additional resources that we do want to make you aware of. On our website, you'll find archived webinars, e-news, library articles, and if you didn't get your question answered tonight, you can submit that question to the Ask the Can Do team, which will be answered by our team of experts. There are also some resources I would like to highlight from the National MS Society. They have a variety of brochures and video segments that can be accessed on their website. But most importantly, as Steve mentioned, you can contact an MS navigator at 1-800-344-4867. Thank you for that resource, Steve. And finally, if you found this webinar to be, not finally, but if you found this webinar to be valuable, please consider donating to Can Do MS or the National MS Society. We do have another resource that is available that will help Can Do MS continue to provide educational programs at no cost. You can join the Kick MS Squad. For more information on that, just check out our website. One other resource I would like to mention is MS Path to Care. It helps you learn more about the importance of a shared decision-making in MS care. So we talked a little bit about our healthcare team, and this is a good resource to learn more about that. Our next webinar is going to be in June, on June 9th, and it's going to be symptom management. We're going to be talking about motor components. So for those participating live tonight, I would ask you to complete the survey that appears on your computer screen following this webinar. And most importantly, I want to thank all of you out there for joining us tonight. These are absolutely unique and unprecedented times, and I'm hoping that for all of you, you have a good memory to take from this time, that we are sheltered in place, safe at home, whatever nuance you are living with right now and have been living with. So thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you so much, Roz. Thank you, Steve. It has been a pleasure working with you. And thank you to everyone out there who joined us this evening.
And stay well, everybody.
Yes, stay well. Stay safe. Take good care, everyone.